This is part two of the discussion of 1963 in the Civil Rights Movement. In 1963, there was the Birmingham campaign, which was called a Project C for confrontation, that they were going to make direct challenges to the segregated system in Birmingham. Obviously, there had been other direct challenges to segregation previous to this. This is perhaps the most well-known campaign of the Civil Rights Movement. As I mentioned previously, Fred Shuttlesworth and other leaders in Birmingham had already been active, but they were joined by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who Shuttlesworth actually helped to establish. But Southern Christian Leadership Conference was King's group, and so Martin Luther King came into town and joined in these protests and brought a sort of more national and even international flavor to this. And one of the most controversial decisions that they made was that decision to include students, young students. And so on May 2nd, 1963, was the Children's Crusade, and many of the children going to school that day and joined in the protests. Now in this campaign, this is when you see the use of police dogs and fire hoses on the protesters. King himself was jailed, and the reason many of the people that went to jail in the Civil Rights Movement often went for trespassing charges with the sit-ins. King actually went for violating that you had to have permission to have a parade, so parading without a permit. And so he finds himself in jail in Birmingham, and he writes this sort of seminal piece of literature in the Civil Rights Movement, and that is the Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And he writes a lot of it on the side in the margins of newspapers. But what the Letter from Birmingham Jail is doing is not so much just criticizing the blatant racists, but it's criticizing those who are critiquing him for being so aggressive. These sort of maybe racial moderates that maybe aren't opposed to a sort of slow integration, but they're sort of challenging King, saying that you're being too aggressive here. And King is also critiquing when people call him an outside agitator. And so he's basically saying that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice anywhere, everywhere in the world. And so this concept of an outside agitator, as Ralph Abernathy, who was sort of King's right-hand man in a lot of ways, had once said that, we're all Americans, we're not outsiders. So the use of the dogs in these things were, again, propaganda gold mines for the Soviets. As that campaign became more aggressive, this sparked even further protests throughout the country, and the pressure was really mounting on Congress and President Kennedy to actually, take more steps, more aggressive steps to try to solve these issues. So focus here on a particular day. June 11th really is this day, 1963, that shows so many of the themes of the Civil Rights Movement. You have this hardline segregationist, George Wallace, the governor of Alabama. In his inaugural speech that year, in 1963, he, uttered the famous phrase, "I say segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." And so George Wallace had really sort of campaigned on this racial rhetoric and, avoiding integration in Alabama. So he literally stood in the registrar's office. Of course, this is before he had online registration, things like this. You actually had to go to a site. And he literally stood where they were holding registration at the University of Alabama and stood in the door and said he was going to block the registration of black students. There had been federal rulings that made this highly illegal, and it really was a show. He understood that if he literally tried to block them, he was going to go to jail. And so the federal authorities there, including Nicholas Katzenbach, sort of confront him, and George Wallace has his sort of moment of literally standing in the door, but ultimately has to capitulate and allow the black students into the University of Alabama. So that night, after this very symbolic event, that night, John F. Kennedy gives a speech on civil rights. He addresses several of the sort of deeper issues, But he also then, what is really significant about the speech is he calls for, support for the Civil Rights Bill. And it would ultimately have to go through Congress and would ultimately pass in 1964 after Kennedy had been assassinated and Johnson was now the president. That very night, it was technically not June 11th, it was technically June 12th, the morning, very early in the morning. Medgar Evers, who was a NAACP member leader in Mississippi, he was assassinated in his own driveway. And this, in a lot of ways, as well as the seeking support for the Civil Rights Bill, these are some of the factors, and of course, all the activists that have been doing so many things for years, and some of them really stepping up their efforts in 1963, was what provides the context for the March on Washington.